I'm going to begin this talk by telling you a little about how I got involved in climate change. And you'll notice on some of my slides, there is a date, in this case, 1980, and next to it, there is a little notation about parts per million, ppm. That number, 341, indexed to this date, 1980, tells you how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere during that year. So that's just something you can notice as we move along through the talk. So in 1980, I came to the University of Colorado as an assistant professor of philosophy. But well, this is interesting. Why? Okay, I soon fell in with a group of scientists at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And some early research on climate change was being done at that time. And I learned several lessons about climate. And my first lesson about climate that I learned from my friends was that people are badly adapted to just normal climate variability. And there are many examples of this. There is the Great Drought, for example, that occurred in the late medieval period that had terrible, severe impacts, including in South America, leading to the extinction, really, of the Tiwanaku civilization around Lake Titicaca, but really had impacts all over the Americas. 1816 was famously the year without summer due to the eruption of Krakatoa volcano in Indonesia, which led to famine in China, flooding in Europe, food riots all over Europe. And in the United States in the 1930s, we had the Dust Bowl experience that was created by drought, which set off an enormous internal migration in the United States from the Midwest, in the lower Midwest, to the West Coast. So the first lesson about climate then is, even without climate change, we're not very good just with extreme events and predictable variability. The second lesson that I learned about climate change was that the existence of the greenhouse effect may actually be the best established result in planetary science. There really is no controversy around the existence of the greenhouse effect. This slide essentially gives you a simple story of how atmospheres work to trap warming. I'm not going to go over it in detail in the interest of time, but it's essentially because of the greenhouse effect that our planet is habitable. If you just calculated the temperature of Venus, Earth, and Mars on the basis of their distance to the sun, what you would discover is that in the case of Venus, which has a very dense heat-trapping atmosphere, the actual temperature is a hellish 474 degrees centigrade, much hotter than you would predict on the basis of its distance from the sun. In the case of Mars, which lost its atmosphere, it's extremely cold. It's the temperature you would predict. And in the case of the Earth, we would be a much, much colder planet were it not for the greenhouse effect of our atmosphere, which makes Earth just right. Such a happy and wonderful place to be. The third lesson that I learned about climate is that we are forcing the climate system through human action. That before the Industrial Revolution, there were about 278 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When I started learning about climate, it was at 341 parts per million. And when I started writing about climate, we were at about 350 parts per million. And the problem is that we inject carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And as a rough analogy, it behaves like water that's in a bathtub with a drain from which the water leaves the bathtub at a very, very, very slow rate. And that's why, even if we reduce emissions, that is to turn the valve down on the bathtub, the atmospheric concentrations can still continue to increase because the carbon dioxide leaves the atmosphere at such a slow rate. In fact, about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide that we emit remains in the atmosphere for centuries. Now, the climate system is extremely complex, and you can't really understand the climate just by understanding the atmosphere. You have to know something about the oceans, you have to know something about land surface, and so on. And these are all my very smart friends at the National Center for Atmospheric Research who back at that time were busy trying to couple these atmospheric models with ocean models. It was a very exciting time to be working on these issues. But yet it seemed clear enough by the late 1980s that there might be some ethical, moral, political questions about justice that were being suggested by the possibility of this human-caused global warming. So I was beginning to write on those issues in the late 80s and early 90s, as was Henry Shue at Cornell University, who later moved to Oxford. But what I really thought when I was writing my early papers in the late 80s and early 90s was that there would be some feedback in a climate system that would prevent the warming. Again, our understanding of the atmosphere and the way it was coupled with the ocean and the land was sufficiently primitive at that time that I sort of thought that nature would somehow save us from this result. And if that wasn't the case, then I figured that somehow the adults in the world, the people who run the world, would somehow figure out how to manage this problem before it became serious. And indeed, for a while, it looked like we were heading in that direction. At the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, the largest gathering of heads of state ever in the world, the Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. And in the Framework Convention, it was stated that the ultimate objective of this convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. In other words, all of the adults, all of the leaders of these countries, all of them without exception, were committed in 1992 and committed their nations to stabilizing concentrations before we got to a dangerous place. But they failed. And the end of this process, from my point of view, was we saw it in Copenhagen in 2009. And here you see a picture of the most powerful people in the world in a hastily convened meeting, trying to just write out on a piece of paper some fairly meaningless agreement that they could come to so that they could all leave town without getting trapped by demonstrators and news reporters and disappointed citizens. In 1992, globally, we were emitting 22 gigatons of carbon per year. After 17 years of negotiations, we were emitting 31 gigatons of carbon. In other words, instead of turning down that valve on the bathtub, we had turned up the valve on the bathtub. And the amount of carbon that was now in the atmosphere had increased to 387 parts per million. And so this is an artwork that was done in around 1992 of politicians discussing global warming as they were increasingly going underwater. So I wrote a book about this, which has already been referred to, called Reason in a Dark Time: Why the Struggle Against Climate Change Failed and What It Means for Our Future. And honestly, I was quite astonished at how badly we as a global community had bungled it. In the United States, the Republicans had become know-nothing science deniers. The Democrats did little to address this problem when they had a chance. Most people in the country seemed very complacent about the issue. Almost everyone I talked to, even many of my colleagues in the university, seemed to misunderstand the issues that were involved. And globally, most countries seemed more interested in in articulating and forwarding their own conception of justice than they were in preventing climate change. Now, some reasons for this are obvious: widespread scientific ignorance, corporate funded denialism about the problem, particularly in the part of the fossil fuel industries, and systematic political and economic failures within certainly the United States and some other societies as well. But there were deeper issues here, and some of these deeper issues involved moral psychology. This is an extended quotation from a psychologist, Daniel Gilbert, who says, when people feel insulted or disgusted, they generally do something about it, such as whacking each other over the head or voting. Moral emotions are the brain's call to action. And although all human societies have moral rules about food and sex, none has a moral rule about atmospheric chemistry. Yes, global warming is bad, but it doesn't make us feel nauseated or angry or disgraced, and we don't feel compelled to rail against it as we do against other momentous threats to our species, such as flag burning. The fact is that if climate change were caused by gay sex or by the practice of eating kittens, millions of protesters would be massing in the streets. The problem is the behavior, the actions that we do that collectively cause climate change are quite banal, everyday actions. It involves travel. It involves the way we heat and cool our houses. It involves our diet. And we have a kind of common sense morality that doesn't call into question any of those actions. This is a cartoon from Tom the Dancing Bug, and this cartoon does a pretty good summary of what morality is for most people in most countries in most of the world. And this common sense morality doesn't take the future consequences of our actions seriously into account. It doesn't take very seriously the consequences of our actions for non-humans. And it certainly doesn't take complicity or contribution to collectively bad outcomes very seriously into account. Let's see. So going even deeper, evolution built us to respond to accessible, rapid movements of middle-sized objects in our visual fields. Evolution did not build us to respond to the emissions of invisible, odorless, tasteless gases that concentrate in the atmosphere and probably cause harms. We're better at sensing than at thinking. You know, we say we're the rational animals, but we're actually quite bad at thinking in terms of thinking, motivating action. Compare putting your hand on a hot stove with knowing that the stove is hot. Now, if carbon dioxide were actually visible instead of an invisible gas, I think we would be much more likely to act on carbon pollution. And so as a result, we wind up in this situation where collectively we're causing this catastrophic series of events in the world, but individually we tend not to feel responsible for this. Now, what I'm going to do now is to play you about a 5 or 6 minute animation that I think conceptually brings out the failings of our common sense moralities to actually moralize the kinds of actions that are causing climate change.
So let's consider an example which we understand very well, and our moral psychology tracks our moral judgments. So imagine a very simple case in which Jack intentionally steals Jill's bicycle. Jack is the perp, as we say in the United States. Jill is the victim. She suffered the harm. She's lost her bicycle. And Jack is a wrongdoer because he did it intentionally. He made Jill worse off because he wanted to get something that rightfully belonged to her. Now let's change this case a little. Let's suppose that Jack is part of an unacquainted group of strangers, each of which, acting independently, takes one part of Joe's bike, resulting in the bike's disappearance. So what happens in this case is that Joe suffers the harm, she's lost her bike, but Jack is just responsible for taking the handlebars. He didn't steal the bike, he just took one small part of the bike. It just so happened that there were other people who also took other small parts of the bike. Well, what Jack did was wrong. We don't have any trouble saying that. But what he did doesn't seem to be as bad as what he did in example 1. Now consider example 3. Jack takes one part from each of a large number of bicycles, one of which belongs to Joe. So let's imagine that in this case, Jack actually gets a bicycle, and he gets it by assembling the parts of a bicycle from a large number of people. So in this case, Jack benefits every bit as much as he did in example 1, but actually no one loses their bicycle. A lot of people lose bits of their bicycle, but nobody loses an entire bicycle. So again, it's clear that what Jack did was wrong, but it's not as wrong, it seems, as in example 1. Now, let's look at example 4. Jack and Joe live on different continents, and the loss of Joe's bicycle is really just the consequence of a causal chain that begins with Jack ordering a used bicycle at a shop. So in this example, we're now thinking of Jack as someone who doesn't intentionally deprive Joe of a bicycle. He doesn't know Joe. He doesn't even live on the same continent as Joe. He'd be quite happy if Joe continued to have a bicycle. But by ordering this bicycle in a shop, Jack is actually causally involved in Joe's loss of her bicycle. Now, I think by the time we reach example 4, it becomes less clear that what Jack does is wrong, since he's not acting intentionally. But there's not much question that we think Joe is being wrong. She's suffering. She's a victim. Now, imagine example 5. Jack lives many centuries before Joe and consumes materials that are essential to bicycle manufacturing. As a result, it will not be possible for Joe to have a bicycle. But I think that by the time we get to this example, we may think that Joe is unfortunate, and we may think that Jack's generation is in some ways greedy or not paying enough attention to those who live after them. But it's not so clear anymore that what Jack does is exactly wrong, as opposed to, in some way, selfish. And indeed, example 5 is beginning to sound like business as usual, as the way that most of us live our lives in the cultures in which we live. Now let's put all of these factors together in example 6. And let's suppose that acting independently, Jack and a large number of unacquainted people set in motion a chain of events that causes a large number of future people who will live in another part of the world from ever having bicycles. Now, we've come quite a ways from example 1. And I think that the climate change case, the case of me flying to Perth or me flying to San Diego, is more like example 6 than it is like example 1. And that's why we don't have the moral psychology about flying to San Diego or flying to Perth that we have about killing people. What happens is that as a result of climate change, people die, but no one intends their death. They would not die were it not the case that many, many, many people acting independently, going about their own business, together produce these results. So with climate change, we seem to have a case in which terrible things occur in the world, but yet no one feels responsible.
So the problem, in a way, is that if we go back to the time of Aristotle, Aristotle would not recognize the physics that we have today. He wouldn't recognize the biology that we have today. But Moses would recognize the ethics that we have today. Common sense morality, as it's still practiced and instilled in most of us today, is very, very similar to what was inscribed on the tablets that Moses brought from the mountain. The world has changed. The conditions of life have changed radically. We face new kinds of problems, but yet our moral concepts have not kept pace. Now, climate change is not going to await any revolutions in our economics or morality or the refashioning of our brains. So what next? Now, I'm going to move very, very quickly here then to try to move through some material and to wrap things up. This is where we start in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases. All of the curves continue to move up. We're turning those valves ever wider rather than closing them off. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now 50% greater than it was before the Industrial Revolution. And the warming is essentially tracking the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And these concentrations are going to be there for centuries into the future, affecting climate for centuries into the future. Now, what this means is that climate change is now a fact. It is no longer a problem to be solved. Now, climate change will give rise to many, many, many problems, including, for example, the drought that you are all experiencing today in Chile, which is in part a climate change driven drought. And these impacts that climate change will bring, from drought to other extreme events, to sea level rise, to migration, setting off migrations, stresses on political systems and so on, they in turn will give rise to a whole range of ethical issues about how much to emit and who gets to emit, about how to distribute the costs of adaptation, about how we feel about the impacts on non-human nature, how we feel about directly intervening in climate systems to try to cool the earth. All of these problems driven by climate change will pose ethical challenges. But the most fundamental ethical challenge that this new world of climate change poses is really the question of how should I live? What is it to be a responsible person in this new transformed world? Now, there's essentially three dimensions of responsibility. If there's anything about that's meaningful about the question, how should I live? It's really about what should I be responsible for? What does agency mean in this world? And we can distinguish being responsible, what am I responsible for, from holding responsible. What do I do to hold others, whether they're corporate actors or individuals or political states? Who do I hold responsible? And then what will I take responsibility for changing? Now, moral change is possible. Agency matters, responsibility matters. If we go back, for example, to the British abolition of the slave trade, up to the very moment that Britain was really the first actor to abolish the slave trade, it actually dominated the slave trade. And it constituted about 4% of Britain's national income. And it continued to cost the British nearly 2% of their national income for nearly 60 years in essentially enforcing their values on others. So moral change is possible, but it's not inevitable. History does not have a direction. It's up to people to make those changes. Someday those banal acts like flying and eating meat that drive climate change may no longer be seen as banal facts, but as things that we really, that are really wrong for us to do. But that is only going to happen if people make change in our normative outlooks. Now, some of you might have been thinking, what about the Paris Agreement? Doesn't that represent a fresh start? And the answer is yes and no. The Paris Agreement, to a very great extent, is a recapitulation of the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Paris Agreement itself is a platform, it's a venue from which change can be made, but there's nothing about the Paris Agreement itself that makes change inevitable or that dictates change. But it is an important focal point for us to begin to try to deal with the problems that climate change is giving rise to. And moral leadership from individuals is extremely important in this process. But it's also true that it takes citizen action far beyond the kind of leadership that any particular individuals may give. Since I am giving this talk at a Catholic institution, I do want to remind us of the moral leadership that Pope Francis has given on this issue, and the kind of role model that he's been in taking problems like climate change seriously. But ultimately, it's up to us. It's up to us as individuals to help to model new norms and new ethics that are responsive to a world in which climate change will not be prevented, but it is a fact. And our challenge is to live meaningful lives in that world, and also to respond to the inevitable problems that climate change is already posing in a just and sustainable way. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dale, for that extremely interesting and provocative talk. We are now going to have a short 10-minute response from Professor Juan Carlos Castilla. Profesor Castilla es profesor titular en el Departamento de Ecología en la Universidad Católica. His primary research interests are in marine ecology, coastal oceanography, and the management and conservation of coastal ecosystems. Professor Castilla has been a pioneering figure at the forefront of research in these areas nationally, again, for more than a quarter of a century, and has also contributed greatly to these fields at the international level as well. I think he also has something around 350 different publications. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. He's a full member of the Chilean Academy of Sciences. He's also a member of the Third World Academy of Sciences. In 2010, he won the Premio Nacional de Ciencias Aplicadas. And with that, I will hand the floor over to Professor Castilla for a short response. Thank you, Juan Carlos.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, good afternoon to everybody. Juan Larraín, thanks for the invitation. Sasha, thank you for the kind introduction. And Dale, thank you for your nice, interesting, personal, and comprehensive talk on climate change ethics. What I have planned for this 10 minutes talk is something perhaps complementary to Dale's talk. Indeed, I will call attention to climate change from a more local perspective, not a global perspective, but a more local perspective. And I will suggest a way, among many ways, to engage Chileans in climate change ethics. So let me start by calling attention to two major global approaches to cope with climate change. The first, as you will know and have be exposed to it is think global and act local. Even if locally we solve the local problem, that will not satisfy the global situation. But the idea is to think globally and not locally. And the second is that to solve the climate change crisis, we will need to use polycentric approaches, as Dale, indicated with the different examples. This is to say top-down, bottom-up, and I will add collective actors, because bottom-up can be interpreted as personal actors. Like we need top-down, bottom-up, and collective actors. In synthesis, I have little time. To me, the crisis is typically a commons problem. And indeed, right now, we are living in the middle of the tragedy, which in turn is immersed in a perfect storm matrix. So it's a common problem, but it is always a perfect storm situation. Surely top-down global national plans and actions are absolutely essential to cope with the crisis. But very importantly, as Dale pointed out by the end of his talk, people need to be engaged as soon as possible in this crisis as actors. In this presentation, I will call local to Chile. So local to me will be Chile, okay? I'm not meaning that solving the problems in Chile, we will solve the global problem, but let us focus in Chile. And first, I suggest that in general, Chileans are not duly ethically engaged in this crisis. Second, I suggest a way by which this might be approached or solved. So to engage Chileans into personal and community ethical modifications of behaviors regarding the crisis. This is an urgent task, not easily to achieve, and that it will take a long time to do it. But we must start the process. So in order to make progress in that particular direction, allow me to advance two main propositions. The first proposition is that Chile, among developing countries, is in an absolutely unique position to develop a local ethical approach to the climate change crisis. We are in a very unique position, and I will show you some examples of that. To me, this is in part due to the outstanding scientific progresses made about the Chilean climate situation, obviously framed into the global crisis, and also to the already agreed Chilean public policies on climate change. Those two things are extremely important and make us unique, not only among developing countries, but around the world. The second proposition is based on my experience, and it is that in general, Chileans are not well aware of the world progress. People are not aware of our progress. And this is true even for the elites. It's not just general public. I think it's true even for the elites. And therefore, they are not really proud. Chileans are not really proud of the advances made in the country. And proud here is a word and a concept extremely important from the ethical point of view. It's a platform from the ethical point of view. And if Chileans will be proud of the progress made, they will show hope. I don't see Chileans, hoping for changes. And hope is another critical word here. And that based on that, it should be much more easier to introduce proactive ethical changes and conducts regarding the crisis. Okay, I have just a few minutes or seconds left. So let me finish by offering you 4 main Chilean examples leading to local climate change proudness. And perhaps we can discuss them later. First, our 2050 carbon neutrality compromise. We took, as a country, that compromise 2 or 3 years ago. And I should add here, the COP25 experience as well. Those are 2 very important, examples of the Chilean progress. Second, Chile very impressive advances regarding the generation of clean energy. In Chile, we're not very aware of that, but outside Chile, this is called Chile's energy revolution. Chile's energy revolution. That is known the situation outside. And one example of which is that the target to reach by 2030, only 8 more years, is 70% of clean energy injected into the Chilean energy market. That's very unique around the world. We're just 8 years away from that goal, and we will make it. I'm absolutely sure that we will make it. Third, the important advances that Chile has made in electromobility, and we can observe them particularly in the buses in Santiago. And fourth, Chile's 2020 fourth report on climate change from the Minister of the Environment, which is about 400 pages. And that report is not just leading to the 2050 carbon neutrality, but include specific details on targets and how to reach them, sector by sector, industry by industry, activity by activity. So, getting to the end, I finished the talk just by asking you Chileans, how many in the audience are fully aware of the above? How many? And moreover, I have read that climate change. How many of you have read that climate change national document, which is in the web? I have done it. I've read it. And as Chilean, I'm extremely proud of it. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Professor Castilla. Thank you. Okay, we're going to be opening the floor for questions now. And se puede ir posteando preguntas en inglés o español en el chat, o si lo prefieren también pueden hacerlas levantando la mano y luego haciendo las preguntas en voz alta.
Sacha, I can make a question so we give some time to the other people.
Yeah, muy bien. Juan Larraín, yeah, adelante.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I enjoyed very much. I'm not in the field of climate change, so very interesting for me. It raised my attention, the slide where you put Aristotle and Moses, and you comment that probably Moses and the 10 Commandments will be more helpful or more prepared to provide answers, perhaps solutions to the current situation. So then you also close with the Pope that, of course, is very relevant for us. But my question is that, do you think, or what is your thinking about the role of religion to work about these issues? Because it seems, of course, ethics and moral and religions are very related, but they're not identical. But I don't know, it raised my attention that you put this slide with Moses. So I would like if you can explain more why you put that slide and make the difference between the possible contribution from Moses and Aristotle today. Thank you very much.
Okay, so first of all, for those of you who are movie fans, the slide was actually of Charlton Heston as Moses in the movie The Ten Commandments. So, but I want to be clear about the purpose of that slide. The purpose of that slide was not to say that the 10 Commandments or common sense morality are adequate to the challenges that we face. In fact, I wanted to suggest the opposite. What I wanted to suggest is that so here's one way of looking at it. When Aristotle was writing his physics and his biology, and when Moses was bringing the 10 Commandments from the mountain, we were essentially in a Bronze Age world. You know, there wasn't a Silicon Valley, there was a Bronze Valley, if you will. We were in an extremely low density world. Communities were very small. And since that time, our science has changed radically, in part reflecting the new conditions of life and in part reflecting just simply greater understanding. But our ethics is essentially the same. Now, you can sort of argue about the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, what's in the scope of the object of the killing? Does it include fetal life? Does it include animal life? And so on. But the core commandments are basically the same. And what's characteristic of them is it's a very individualist ethics. It's not an ethics of collective action. There's no commandment that says, thou shalt not join with a billion other people in emitting small bits of carbon into the atmosphere that will change the climate. So I was trying to draw a contrast between the undeveloped nature of our ethics compared to the highly developed nature of our science over the last several millennia. Now, as far as the role of religion goes, I think that's a really difficult question, and I'm certainly not an expert. I think there is a way of viewing the role of religion where, at least on the surface, it looks like religious leaders lead, that they can bring people to new ethical and moral understandings of the world. But we also know that leaders and followers are closely linked. And so the degree to which religious leaders are, so to speak, following the movement of their own followers seems to me also to be true. And exactly what that relationship is, I am not confident about what to say. But I will say this: I am much happier having Pope Francis issuing Laudato Si than I would be to have another Pope who was speaking a very, very different language, one that was not about respecting the earth and God's creation.
Okay, very good. I'm going to move us along because we have an increasingly long list of questions now that we will hope to get through. So next then, please go ahead, Matias Cortes.
Thank you for the talk. It was, I'm a big fan. I would like to ask, to what level should we integrate like climate ethics into policy solutions? Because, or can we conceptualize an ethical development that engages in climate change action and at the same time fights, for example, class-based exploitation? Because when we think of, for example, renewable energies in Chile, it is a field that has developed, but at what cost? And many times we see local communities which are faced with ever-increasing electricity costs, environmental problems, and like. So can we balance those two things?
Well, that's an excellent point that you're making, Matthias. And it's not, I would say, even a question of balancing, it's a question of integrating. I mean, one thing that we know from history, going back to this period, for example, in European history that was called the Little Ice Age, to looking at what happens when you have extreme events, you have droughts, you have you have storms. It's always the poor and the least powerful who are always damaged the most by these events. Disasters only accentuate and exaggerate the underlying inequalities in the society. In fact, I think we're all seeing this in the global COVID pandemic as well. The injustices that are a consequence of the COVID pandemic are pre-existing injustices that are now accentuated by the fact of the pandemic. The one point that you make that I think is a very important point is that even when you get new technologies and new technological developments, they too, even this kind of change, can also further accentuate and exaggerate existing inequalities and injustices. And in a way, it's not surprising because technology is owned and driven by people with power in a society. And so it's going to as a first approximation, be deployed in a way that serves or exaggerates the existing class interests. At the same time, these innovations do pose the possibility of trying to address these problems. So the technologies don't replace the need to do politics. They just become another site, another place in which the struggle for equality and justice has to take place.
Great. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Professor Jamieson. I'm going to now, I'm taking the questions in the order in which they have appeared, and I'm going to be reading you a question from Francisco Melo, who asks, what is the relative impact in global CO2 emissions of, in the first instance, human population size, and in the second instance, specific geological events, for example, a significant volcano eruption? Francisco Melo writes, I mean, even if we set up better policies to attack this problem, will that be sufficient?
Well, nothing will be sufficient. And in fact, the point that I was trying to make is that climate change is no longer a problem to be solved. We are in a world of climate change, and it's going to be a very, very tough ride. And in fact, I mean, there is this term called the Anthropocene, which some people love and some people hate. But what it indicates is that increasingly we are living in a human-dominated planet. And it's not just that we've disrupted the carbon cycle, we've disrupted most of the Earth's fundamental cycles, whether it's the hydrological cycle or whether it's the cycle of other elements as well. And we're stuck with that. There's no going back in the short run. We have to learn how to surf this, how to manage this, how to live with this. And population is, of course, a factor with this, because energy use and consumption currently is associated, as the previous questioner pointed out, with having the means to live a decent life. And so the larger the population that you have, if you have the aspiration, as we all should have and hope we do have, that everyone on the planet will live decently, then this does commit you at this point to increases in energy consumption, and all energy consumption involves some perturbation of the natural order. So we need to do what we can to get into new sources of energy that are less disruptive, but we also should be reminded, even though it's not very popular to say, that there is a population dimension to environmental problems, as well as a consumption dimension to environmental problems. And Francisco is quite right to remind us of that. Great,
thank you. And here I have another question for you from, this time from Veronica Irarrázaval, and I'm translating this now from the Spanish. She writes, it seems that the strategy of trying to mobilize people through fear and this discourse of catastrophe isn't very effective. It seems that in many cases, actually, this strategy backfires and people end up feeling overwhelmed and paralyzed and helpless in the face of a problem that looks altogether overwhelming. Entonces, how should we reframe the discourse in order to avoid this type of challenge?
So, Veronica, I hope someone will translate. I apologize that I cannot respond in Spanish, and I hope someone can translate this response. We have a real challenge with climate change because people rightfully point out that despair does not motivate people. In fact, quite the opposite. So there is an enormous amount of pressure for those of us who talk about climate change to in some way try to be optimistic, to have a positive message. But there comes a point when you have to tell the truth. And I feel in the way that I speak and in the way that I write, I try not to be either optimistic or pessimistic. I try to be bracingly realistic about the issues that we face and what this means for our future. And in fact, in some way, I feel that the concern to be hopeful, the concern to be optimistic, has been one of the things that have led us away from confronting how serious the problems are that we actually face. There's always, the environmentalist rhetoric is often, this is the last chance to save the planet, but 10 years ago, it was the last chance to save the planet. Now it's the last chance to save the planet. In 10 years, it will be the last chance. This isn't about saving the planet. This is about learning how to live on this planet in a way that is in accord with the kinds of changes that we are bringing about on this planet. And we need to stare this in the face and recognize that some things are irreversible. We have lost things. We have profoundly lost things because of climate change and human-caused extinctions. That doesn't mean human life will come to an end. It doesn't mean there won't be happy people in the year 2100. There will be, but we have to manage that future. And the only way we can do that is by staring the reality in the face.
Thank you. Here is a question now from Valeria de los Rios, who asks, what is the role of the university in the face of climate change? As a multifactorial event, I am especially interested in whether an approach is necessary that includes not only science, but also an inter or transdisciplinary perspective in which the arts and humanities play a role.
So I am enthusiastically on the side of your questions. I think, when climate change was a problem that could be solved, maybe then it was a relatively narrow scientific problem. But now that climate change is a fact that affects everything about our lives, from droughts and hurricanes to our sense of control over our own futures, to what our political institutions are like. In fact, I argue in other places that climate change is one of the things, not the only thing, but it's one of the things that is already starting to put pressure on quite vulnerable democratic institutions in many societies around the world, because climate change is a problem that our institutions have not successfully addressed. And for that reason, this is one of the things that can call their legitimacy into account. So yes, we are now in a world in which everything matters, the arts, the humanities, and so on. I'll just say one more thing about universities specifically. Each nation has a different tradition in how universities were founded, what their function was conceived as. In the United States, we have a history of what were called land-grant universities. These were universities that were created mostly in the American West and Middle West as part of the expansion of white settlement in the country. And these universities had a special charge to help with agriculture, to help with natural resources in various ways. Some people have been talking about rewriting this idea of the land-grant university as the Anthropocene university. And the idea is that universities need a new charter so that they will be responsive to the problems that we face today, just as a century ago they had another charter in which they were required to be responsive to the problems of that day.
Great, thank you. I'm going to recognize now Christian Bonacic. I see a hand there. Veo la mano.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. We all know that there are many burning issues related to climate change, and most of them are related to human well-being. But in that sense, we have also two pathways for solutions. One is the engineering climate change, using engineering and science and technology to solve the problems that are pressing humanity. And in the other one is the nature-based solutions, which is the one that I work with. In that sense, in nature-based solutions, we argue that biodiversity plays an important role for climate change mitigation or solving the problem. But the main reasons because biodiversity can be argued as an important issue is far from the interest of humankind, because if we argue that they provide ecosystem services, then we're fine with the interest of humanity. And at last, we can argue about the intrinsic value of biodiversity. But do you have any other way to bridge the interest of humankind with the interest of protecting other kind of species or life on Earth beyond the ecosystem services argument or just the intrinsic value?
Well, there are several very good questions there, and all I can do is wave in directions. So in terms of nature-based solutions, this is a question, of course, that in a city like New York, we face very directly, because there are some people that would essentially like hard engineering solutions to our inevitable sea level rise and our inevitable reoccurrence of storms like Sandy. And there are other people who say, no, we've got to do some retreat from vulnerable areas on the rivers. We need to bring back the oyster beds. We need to, to bring back these sort of organic buffers between us and sea levels. Now, on that question, I mean, I'm firmly on the side of the soft path rather than the hard path for all sorts of reasons we could indicate. The more general question I think you were asking, though, is how do we get people motivated to be really interested in conservation, in sort of protecting other animals and species for their own sake? And there, I honestly think, for what it's worth, that the instrumental value arguments just don't work. If you look at something like the deforestation of the Amazon, people aren't ripping down forests for no reason. They're ripping down forests because it's in their economic self-interest to do that. And you can talk about corrupt governments and so on and so forth, but there's no guarantee that the economics will ever favor the preservation of other forms of life on the planet, any more than the economics will necessarily favor the preservation of old people on the planet or disabled people on the planet. At some point, you have to put your feet down and make a moral argument for respect for these other forms of life. That's my view anyway.
Thank you.
Great. And before passing on to this next question, I just also wanted to invite Juan Carlos, if you want to jump in and join the discussion on any of these issues, please feel free. Please feel free to do so. We're passing now then to a question from Pablo Geni, who writes, will the COVID-19 pandemic make any meaningful impact on climate change?
It's just very, very hard to say. There are so many interesting interrelations between COVID and climate change. I wrote a piece with one of my colleagues that was published in One Earth early in this pandemic, which basically made the argument that it was our inability to organize ourselves to solve problems, to have sort of central governmental and problem-solving authorities that was the kind of core problem with both climate change and COVID, that we essentially in all these cases have devolved into something more like a Hobbesian war of all against all, instead of this creating bridges of cooperation. So one question, I think, is whether we will, as a global community or as individual nations, will learn from this eroding of public sector and cooperative goods to actually try to reconstruct those things. I'm not particularly confident about that. It just remains to be seen. A second thing, of course, is the relationship between climate change and global pandemic in the first place, that the more that we continue to transform nature, the more likely we are to produce the kinds of consequences that we've seen with COVID. And in some ways, the interesting thing about COVID is how destructive it's been to the global economic order and to life in many countries, while at the same time, not having a very high mortality rate as viruses go and not being that transmissible as viruses go. It's very, very easy to imagine that the next global pandemic might well be much worse than COVID. Whether we'll take this as a warning or whether when the peak of the epidemic passes, we'll just think, oh, it's time to party again, business as usual. This remains to be seen, I think.
Gracias. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And again, we're just proceeding in the order in which the questions appeared. So we have one more written question, and then there's a hand that I'll recognize. This is a question from Iñaki Goñi, who writes, how to engage citizens in climate efforts without framing the issue under the deficit model of science communication, constructing the idea of the public as lacking knowledge, lacking motivation, lacking goodwill. In this sense, does the urgency of climate change, challenge ideals of a democratic governance of science?
Well, I think it does challenge a lot about science and the place of science in society. I think generally when it comes into science communication, we're sort of stuck on these two models. One is that, you know, people are like empty. This is what Inaki's referring to, is, for those of you who don't know, is the deficit model, that people are sort of these empty bottles that need to be filled up with scientific knowledge. That's obviously a bad model for lots of reasons. But the alternative model tends to be that you have to get these messages into trusted social networks, which often mean people's brothers-in-law, people they go to church with, and perhaps in many cases quite ignorant people who, for all sorts of bad reasons, that they trust. Now, one reason I called my book Reason in a Dark Time is I am an old Enlightenment kind of person, in the sense that I think we have a collapse of reason. It's not that people don't know things, it's that collectively we are not good at reasoning together. And I think if that doesn't change, especially in an age of social media and mass disinformation, if climate change doesn't kill us off, something else will. We need to become more collectively rational. And this isn't just about knowledge, but neither is it about trusting our brother-in-law.
Great, thank you. And I recognize now Raul Madrid.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jamieson. I would like to ask you the following question. There are doctrines that affirm that the existence of man, even in its most virtuous version, is harmful to environment. Often these are nihilistic conceptions which claim that even the mere existence of human species is evil. These doctrines are also connected to an idea of the redistribution of power on Earth to eliminate the so-called exceptionality of human being who has set himself as a dominant force on Earth. How do you approach to this problem? Is human being by essence a predatory species, or on the contrary, it is just, it's not an essential philosophical problem, it's just an accidental one and it could be corrected? How do you think about this?
Right, so most problems, especially conceptual ones, can't be solved. That's why they're problems. So what you have to do is to dissolve them rather than solve them. And once you set humanity against nature, as if nature without humanity has some privileged status, this is good, and all human transformations of nature are intrinsically bad because they're human transformations of nature. This is a problem that will never be solved. We need to view ourselves more, I think, as one species living on this planet with other species. And the problems arise because of the incredible dominating and transformative role that this species has on the planet. And this would be a problem if it were beavers that were dominating the planet in the ways that humans are, or if it were ticks that were dominating the planet in the way that humans are. It's our scale of our impact and our numbers that are the problem. So the solution is not, so it isn't that we're intrinsically evil. It's not that in some way the world would be better off without us, or that we should view ourselves as a cancer. It's rather that modesty is a virtue in many ways, including collectively as a species.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm again going to, pass to the next question in the queue. And this is a question from Victor Castellazo, who writes, considering that human values and ethics are endangered in society, are ethics enough for solving this global problem? And I think he adds a follow-on question to clarify that, writing, if we as a society failed in diminishing the impact of climate change in the world, or failed at stopping climate change, where is the hope?
Well, so I think the hope is to live in truth, not live in illusion. And I think, and abandonment of agency and hopelessness is yet another kind of illusion. That either the world is at our beck and call, or there's nothing we can do about it. They're both wrong. We can regulate our own behavior. We can make changes in the world that are in accord with our values, but we can only do that by staring the world in the face directly and truthfully. Hope, the hope that exists for human civilization, for the future of the planet, is not a hope that is given to us by anything transcendental, in my opinion, whether it's a matter of God, or the intrinsic normativity of nature, or the fundamental brilliance of human reason. The hope that we have is that it is possible for us to live in accord with our values, and we can establish values in the light of reason and in the light of our concern for others. But in order to do that, we must be honest with ourselves about both our capacities and our limitations. And I fear that the source of many of our problems has been a lack of honesty, not just denialism about the science, but a kind of denialism about who we are and what we can accomplish.
Thank you. Okay, and here is a question from Marisol Peña. And I see that this one refers to the constitutional process, I think, underway here in Chile. So this might be one in which Juan Carlos también wants to weigh in. Let's see. Marisol Peña writes, in my personal point of view, it would be very important to recognize principles like that of sustainable development and that of intergenerational equity, and also that of increasing participation of local communities in order to adopt the best policies, the best public policies concerning the protection of the environment and natural resources. Hence, it's not only a matter of more rights in the Constitution. So you may or may not be aware, Dale, that there's a constitutional, that's her comment.
Well, yes. So Juan may want to say something about this, but I think the point is well taken. You know, you only get things encoded in law or constitutions that are meaningful if a society is committed to those values. Constitutions are not self-enforcing and they're not self-interpreting. This has certainly been one of the great messages, certainly in the United States in the last few years. It takes people to make a written text of any sort live up to its possibilities.
Okay.
Déjame responder un poquitito en castellano a la pregunta, porque está bien relacionado con Chile. El problema es que de pronto estamos hablando de cambio climático. Y el cambio climático tiene un montón de consecuencias respecto a la sustentabilidad. Yo no tengo duda de eso. Pero la sustentabilidad, digamos, no toda la sustentabilidad está relacionada con el cambio climático. Entonces, si hablamos de cambio climático y la Constitución, específicamente en Chile, hay elementos ya en la Constitución actual, digamos, para vivir en un mundo, digamos, que permita que sea libre de contaminación. Hay elementos en la Constitución. Y lo que yo creo que debería a lo mejor ser parte de la nueva Constitución es ser un poco más claro respecto al cambio climático. Quiero tratar de separar un poquitito el problema del cambio climático, que para sintetizarlo en corto, tiene que ver con el anhídrido carbónico equivalente, no solo el anhídrido carbónico, también el metano, también, etcétera, otras cosas. Entonces, eso no está. Y hay estudios, digamos, hay proposiciones ahora sobre una ley de cambio climático. Entonces, creo que en Chile estamos, no soy tremendamente optimista, pero estamos más avanzados que otros países. Y tenemos la posibilidad, sin duda, creo yo, de llegar al 2050 con un país carbono neutral y con un país 90 o 100% de energía limpia. Y yo creo que somos capaces de hacer eso. Y no cualquier país puede decir eso. Entonces, hablando un poco de la Constitución, esos son elementos que existen y que se están desarrollando. La Constitución tendrá que proteger eso de alguna manera más allá del 2050, etcétera. Entonces, yo soy un optimista realista respecto a Chile. Y eso no soluciona el problema global, porque el cambio global es un problema global. Tenemos que entender eso. Pero respecto a la contribución que nosotros podemos hacer, que es chiquitita, porque nosotros somos responsables del 0,25% de las emisiones. 0,25. O sea, somos muy poco, contribuimos muy poco, pero podemos liderar, por lo menos, el mundo en vía de desarrollo, en el sentido, digamos, que tenemos avances muy importantes. Por ejemplo, lo que decía Bonasic, una de las políticas de Chile, que todo esto está basado en el Acuerdo de París, ¿eh? Yo creo que el Acuerdo de París es un muy buen referente, es en los próximos 30 años o 25 años plantar 200.000 hectáreas de bosque nativo. Ese es un compromiso que está ya en el Ministerio del Medio Ambiente, digamos, y que ha sido puesto en Naciones Unidas. Entonces, esa es una solución natural, no tiene que ver con bioingeniería. ¿Cómo nos comprometemos como país? ¿Cómo hacemos que los colegios de Chile participen en esto? Ese es el desafío. Pero que se deben plantar 200.000 hectáreas de bosque nativo es la solución natural propuesta por Chile para Chile, más 200.000 más hectáreas de bosque que no es nativo. Entonces, hay soluciones naturales. Yo soy, respecto a Chile, un optimista realista. No creo que haya muchos países en el hemisferio nuestro, digamos, que estén con el grado de avance para poder hacer eso. Y eso yo creo que da un sentido de orgullo y un sentido de esperanza, por lo menos como chilenos. Y ahí hay un desafío grande en términos educacionales.
Gracias, Juan Carlos. Nos quedan 3 minutos. We have 3 minutes left, and there's probably time for one final question. What do you think of President Biden's Climate Leaders Summit? Is it a step towards the collective kind of reasoning that we need?
Yes, it is. And again, we're not in a world of magic bullets. We're not in a world in which we can turn past the mistakes of the past and fix everything. But so far, Biden has assembled a really good climate change team, and he's moving forward on this issue as so many other issues, I think, in a sensible way. He's not using the language of American exceptionalism anymore. He's talking more about cooperating with other nations in the world and using American power in a positive way. He's also cooperating with China, a country with which the United States obviously has conflicts in some areas, but when it comes to issues like climate change, it's hugely important for the future of the world for the United States and China to be cooperating on the same side. So thus far, I think, yes, he's moved in all the right directions. But we have this old saying, which probably works in Spanish too, which is that that sound drives out silence. It's much easier to disrupt something. It's much easier to break something than it is to put it back together. But at least we are on the road, I think, to trying to put some things back together.